What if the ground beneath your feet, the very history you dedicated your life to studying, was a lie? For Clara Mae Thompson, a 22-year-old history major moonlighting as a waitress, the past wasn't just in books. It was in the weary lines around her grandmother's eyes, in the tarnished brass key she wore on a chain around her neck, and in the ghost of a father she'd never known. Her life was a delicate balance of serving foie gras to Boston's elite at the exclusive restaurant Aria and spoon-feeding broth to the woman who raised her. A woman whose own history was slowly being erased by the fog of dementia. Then a new customer entered her life, not with a whisper, but with the force of a wrecking ball. Julian Croft, a man whose name was synonymous with progress, a real estate titan who built shimmering glass towers on the rubble of the city's past. His arrogance was a skyline unto itself, vast and imposing. Every condescending remark, every meticulously cruel demand felt like a personal demolition. But Clara had no idea that the man intent on tearing down her city's history was about to excavate a secret buried in her own, a secret that connected his gilded world to the simple brass key resting against her heart. This isn't just the story of a waitress and a billionaire. It's the story of a daughter and a father, separated by ruthless ambition and reunited in the one place he thought he owned, only to discover she held the key to a past he could never buy. The atmosphere inside Aria was a carefully curated performance of tranquility. The clink of crystal glasses, the hushed murmur of conversations about stock options and summering in the Hamptons, the distant sizzle from a kitchen that ran with military precision. It was a world away from Clara's reality. Her reality was a third-floor walk-up in Somerville that smelled faintly of lavender and old paper, a stack of overdue textbooks on a wobbly kitchen table, and the constant, low-level hum of anxiety about her grandmother Eleanor. By day, Clara navigated the complex tapestry of Boston's architectural history for her thesis. Her fingers, nimble from years of turning fragile archival pages, were equally adept at balancing trays heavy with Aria's signature duck confit and decanting bottles of vintage Bordeaux. By night, she sat by Eleanor's bedside, reading aloud from old poetry books, trying to anchor her grandmother's drifting mind to the familiar shores of memory. She was 22, with eyes the color of aged whiskey and a quiet strength forged in the crucible of premature responsibility. Every tip she earned was triaged, first for Eleanor's mounting medical expenses and the specialized in-home care she required, then for rent, and finally, whatever pitiful remainder was left was saved for the research trips she needed for her degree. Her dream wasn't of wealth, but of preservation, of saving the stories etched into the brick and mortar of a city that was constantly trying to forget. On a crisp autumn Tuesday, the embodiment of that forgetting strode into Aria. He didn't just enter, he colonized the space. Julian Croft, tall with a mane of distinguished steel-gray hair and a face carved from granite and impatience. He wore a navy blue suit so exquisitely tailored it seemed to hum with its own power. The ambient noise of the restaurant seemed to dip as he passed, conversations faltering as patrons recognized the man, whose face regularly graced the covers of Architectural Digest and the Wall Street Journal. He was a builder of empires, a destroyer of landmarks. Naturally, he was seated in Clara's section. "I'll take this table," he announced to the young hostess, gesturing to a prime corner booth that was already occupied. He wasn't asking. "Sir, I'm so sorry, but that party has just ordered dessert," the hostess stammered, her face flushing. Croft's gaze, a piercing Arctic blue, swept over the couple at the table, a sweet-looking elderly pair celebrating an anniversary, with an expression of profound irritation, as if their very existence was an inconvenience. "Then move them. I'm on a schedule." Clara stepped in before the hostess could dissolve into tears. She pasted on her professional smile, a thin but resilient shield. "Mr. Croft, welcome to Aria. We have another lovely booth by the window that's just become available. I think you'll find the view of the public garden even better." Her voice was calm, her knowledge of the restaurant's layout her only weapon. She was steering him, not confronting him. He shot her a look, a flicker of something, annoyance at being managed perhaps, before giving a curt nod and striding to the table she indicated. He didn't thank her. He immediately pulled out a sleek, impossibly thin tablet and began swiping through blueprints. Clara placed a leather-bound menu before him. He ignored it. "I'll have a scotch. Macallan 25. One large, perfectly clear ice cube. Not cloudy. If your bartender can't manage that, bring it neat. And I'll have the Wagyu steak, medium rare. Tell the chef if it comes out even a shade past pink in the center, I'll be sending it back to his station personally." Clara's pen glided across her notepad. "Of course, sir. An excellent choice. And will you be starting with anything?" He finally looked up, and his gaze was like being audited. It wasn't just a look, it was an assessment, evaluation. He took in her simple uniform, the slight fraying at her cuffs and the chain around her neck. "I don't have time for starters, miss. I have time for efficiency and competence. Let's see if you can provide at least one of those." He gestured dismissively with his hand, his attention already back on the glowing screen. She retreated, her composure stretched taut. "Did you get the new king?" Marco, another server, asked as she entered the order into the system. "I heard last week he made a busboy repolish every piece of silverware at his table because he saw a watermark." "Sounds about right," Clara muttered. "He wants a single, transparent ice cube." Marco whistled. "Good luck with that. Our ice machine makes cubes cloudier than his soul." Clara went directly to the bar. "Leo, I need your help. It's for Croft at table 12. Leo, the stoic head bartender, just grunted and reached under the counter. He pulled out a special silicone mold he used for cocktails, which produced a single, flawless sphere of ice. He'd learned long ago that with certain customers, it was easier to be prepared than to endure the fallout. She delivered the scotch. Croft swirled the glass, inspecting the ice from every angle before taking a sip without a word of acknowledgement. It was, she supposed, the highest form of praise he was capable of. The steak was an exercise in pure terror. The chef, a temperamental artist named Jean-Pierre, seethed at the implied threat but cooked the steak with the focus of a surgeon. Clara carried the plate to the table holding her breath. Croft cut into the center. It was a perfect, warm red. He took a bite, chewed with a slow, deliberate thoughtfulness that was more intimidating than any outburst. "The sear is adequate," he pronounced finally, "but the béarnaise sauce is pedestrian. It lacks tarragon. Does your chef not know the fundamentals?" Clara's training dictated an apology and offered to replace it. But something else, the wary history student in her who valued authenticity, took over. "Actually, sir, Chef Jean-Pierre makes his béarnaise in the traditional Parisian style, which uses a lighter hand with tarragon to allow the quality of the butter and egg yolk to shine through. It's a matter of philosophy, not error." His chewing stopped. He slowly raised his eyes from the plate to her face. A flicker of surprise crossed his features, so quick she almost missed it. He was not used to being countered, especially not by a waitress. He stared at her for a long, uncomfortable moment, his blue eyes seeming to search her face for something. Then without a word, he returned to his meal. When the bill came, he placed a platinum card on the tray. She returned with the slip, and he scrawled an illegible signature. "The service was not entirely incompetent," he said, the words feeling like shards of glass. He rose, adjusted the cuff of his shirt, and swept out of the restaurant, leaving a wake of cold air. Clara approached the table to clear it, bracing herself. On a bill that exceeded $400, he had left no tip. That wasn't the insult. The insult was the note he had written in sharp architectural script at the bottom of the receipt. It said, "A little knowledge is a dangerous thing." She stared at the words, a hot wave of humiliation and anger washing over her. It wasn't just a dismissal of her service. It was a dismissal of her knowledge, her one small act of defiance. She crumpled the receipt, the paper crinkling in her fist. She didn't realize it then, but this was not a simple, unpleasant encounter. It was the first salvo in a war she didn't know she was fighting. Julian Croft, for reasons that were a mystery even to himself, had found something in her that he felt compelled to crush. He would be back. And so began the Tuesday ritual of torment. Every week, at precisely 1 o'clock, Julian Croft's silver Bentley would pull up to the curb, and he would stride into Aria and take his seat in Clara's section. It was a deliberate choice, an unnerving fixation. He never asked for her. He simply sat and waited, knowing she would have to come. Her stomach would clench the moment she saw him. He became her personal crucible. He would test her knowledge on the wine list, demanding obscure vintages he knew they wouldn't have, just to watch her squirm. A 1982 Chateau Lafite Rothschild? No? How does a restaurant of this supposed caliber fail to stock the basics? He would sneer, knowing full well it was a $10,000 bottle. He dissected every aspect of the restaurant with a surgeon's cold precision, but his critiques always seemed aimed at her. One afternoon, he commented on the building itself. "This place has good bones, I'll give it that. Beaux-Arts, late 19th century, but it's been ruined by sentimental additions, these tacky sconces, this gaudy wallpaper. People cling to the past as if it has some inherent value. It doesn't. Value is created by what you build next. Some people believe value is found in what you preserve," Clara found herself replying, her voice quiet but steady. A cruel, thin smile touched his lips. The mantra of the historian, cataloging decay while the future is built by men of action. Tell me, what future is there in staring at the past? His words were a direct hit, targeting the core of her passion, her life's work. It felt less like a conversation and more like an interrogation of her soul. How could this man, a complete stranger, so expertly pinpoint and attack her deepest held beliefs? She would go home to the small Somerville apartment, feeling flayed and exhausted, the echo of his disdain clinging to her like soot. She'd recount the encounters to Eleanor, whose mind on good days was as clear as a bell. "He sounds like a sad, empty man, my love," Eleanor would say, her hand wrinkled and soft as worn silk, covering Clara's. "Men who build big towers are often just trying to fill a big hole in themselves. Don't let his emptiness spill into you." But Clara couldn't shake the feeling that it was personal. Other wealthy patrons could be demanding, even rude, but Croft's cruelty was different. It was focused. It was like he was searching for a weakness, a crack in her composure he could exploit. The Battle of Wills came to a head on a rainy Tuesday about 6 weeks into his campaign. Aria was housed in a historic landmark building, a fact the restaurant was immensely proud of. That day, Croft seemed particularly dismissive. He ordered the bouillabaisse and complained that the saffron was inferior. Then he gestured at the floor. "This tile work," he said loudly, catching the attention of the nearby tables. "A pathetic attempt at Art Nouveau. Look at the sloppy glazing, the inconsistent pattern. Probably some mass-produced garbage from the 20s. Clara froze. She knew that tile work. She'd spent an entire semester researching the artisans of Boston's Gilded Age. The building was her passion project. "Actually," she said, her voice clear in the sudden quiet, "it's not Art Nouveau. It's an original Rookwood pottery installation from 1898. The artist was a woman named Genevieve Wallace. She was famous for her deliberately imperfect glazing technique, which she called wabi-sabi, inspired by Japanese ceramics. She believed it celebrated the beauty of imperfection. She pointed to a small, barely visible marking in the corner. You can see her maker's mark right there, if you look closely." The entire restaurant was silent. Julian Croft, the man who reshaped the city's skyline, had just been publicly corrected on a point of architectural history by his waitress. He stared at the floor, then back at her, his face a mask of cold fury. The surprise was gone, replaced by something much more dangerous: humiliation. It was in that moment, as she leaned forward slightly to point out the mark, that the chain around her neck swung free. On it hung the old tarnished brass key. It was ornate, with a distinctive four-leaf clover design at its head. It caught the low light of the chandelier, a small, dull gleam against her black uniform. Croft's eyes, which had been locked on her face with piercing intensity, dropped to the key. The effect was instantaneous and terrifying. All the color drained from his face, leaving a sickly, waxy pallor. The arrogant titan of industry disappeared, replaced by a man who looked like he'd been shot. His breath hitched. His hand, which was gripping a water glass, trembled so violently that water sloshed over the rim. "Where?" he started, his voice a raw, strangled whisper that was nothing like his usual commanding tone. "Where did you get that key?" Clara's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against her ribs. This was a reaction far beyond mere anger. This was shock. This was recognition. It was my grandmother's, she said, her own voice trembling slightly as she instinctively clutched the key. She gave it to me. She said, she said it was from my father. His eyes, wide and disbelieving, flew back to her face. But this time he wasn't looking at her uniform or assessing her competence. He was truly seeing her for the first time. He scanned her features, the curve of her jaw, the stubborn set of her mouth, the whiskey-colored eyes so unlike her mother's but so hauntingly familiar. It was the look of a man seeing a ghost in the face of the living. He shoved his chair back with a violent scrape that echoed through the stunned dining room. He threw a wad of cash onto the table, hundreds of dollars. His movements jerky, uncoordinated. "I have to go," he muttered to no one in particular. He all but ran from the restaurant, leaving his half-eaten meal, his jacket, his entire aura of impenetrable control behind him. Clara stood frozen, the warm brass of the key a burning question mark against her skin. The money on the table felt like a confession. The air crackled with the enormity of what had just happened. She looked down at the key, this simple object she had worn her entire life, and realized it wasn't just a memento. It was a catalyst. It had just unlocked something in Julian Croft, and in doing so, had thrown the door wide open on the mystery of her entire existence. The rest of her shift passed in a blur. The whispers of the other staff, the curious glances from patrons. It was all just noise. Her mind was a maelstrom, replaying that moment of raw, unmasked shock on Julian Croft's face. The way he looked at the key, the way he looked at her. The pieces were a chaotic jumble, but they were starting to form a picture she was terrified to look at. She practically ran home, her heart still hammering. She found Eleanor sitting in her favorite armchair, a plaid blanket over her lap, her eyes distant as she watched the evening news. Sometimes the fog was thick, other times it would recede, and Clara prayed tonight was one of the clear nights. "Grandma?" Clara's voice was breathless. She knelt by the chair, taking her grandmother's frail hand. "I need to ask you about the key." Eleanor's gaze slowly focused on her granddaughter's face. "The key? Your key? It's important, Clara May. A promise." "A promise from who? From my father?" Clara pressed, her voice gentle but insistent. "You never told me his name. You only ever called him that ambitious boy." Grandma, today, a man saw this key, and he knew it. She watched as a cascade of emotions flickered across Eleanor's face. Confusion, then a dawning fear, and then a profound ancient sorrow. A single tear traced a path through the landscape of her wrinkles. "It can't be," Eleanor whispered. "After all these years, not him." "Who, Grandma? Who is he?" And then it happened. As if the shock had jolted a loose wire back into place, Eleanor's mind for a moment became achingly clear. The fog burned away, revealing the sharp, intelligent woman she had always been. Her eyes met Clara's, and they were filled with the pain of a story she had carried alone for over 2 decades. "His name was Jay back then," she began, her voice gaining strength, the words flowing as if a dam had broken. "Just Jay, not this Julian Croft he became. He didn't build towers then. He dreamed of them. He was a scholarship boy at Harvard, working as a busboy to pay his way. He had a fire in him, Clara, a hunger to prove he was better than the broken home he came from." She told Clara about meeting him at a protest to save a historic library from demolition. The irony was not lost on Clara. He was all sharp angles and sharper wit, arguing with a passion that both scared and thrilled her. Eleanor, a young nurse full of life and laughter, was his opposite, his anchor. "He wasn't cruel then," Eleanor said, a sad smile touching her lips. "He was intense. He saw the world in black and white, success or failure. But with me, he was gentle. He brought me flowers he'd picked from the public garden. He'd trace the lines of my palm and tell me they led to a future with him." The story unfolded, a ghost taking shape in the dim light of the living room. Their love affair was a whirlwind romance set against the backdrop of 1990s Boston. They were young, poor, and deeply in love. "The Blue Dahlia," Eleanor whispered, her eyes glazing over with the memory. "That was our place, a little underground jazz club in the South End. He said the music was as honest as we were. That key, he gave it to me on our 1-year anniversary. It wasn't the key to the club. It was the key to the apartment above it, a tiny run-down studio we were going to rent together. It was our first real step, our promise. Clara's heart ached, imagining this younger, softer version of the man who had tormented her. What happened to him? What happened to you? Eleanor's face hardened. His ambitions started to win. He got an internship with a ruthless developer. He met powerful people who saw his hunger and cultivated it. He started talking less about the beauty of buildings and more about their square footage. He started to see me not as his partner, but as a distraction from the life he was meant to have. Then came the discovery. Eleanor was pregnant with Clara's mother, Sarah. I told him right outside the Blue Dahlia, under the gaslights. I thought he'd be happy. I thought it would bring him back to us. She took a shaky breath, the memory still sharp enough to cut. He went pale, just like you said he did today. He said a baby wasn't part of his trajectory. He said it was an anchor. My God, he called his own child an anchor. The sequence of events that followed was a brutal, clinical execution of a heart. Julian disappeared. A week later, a lawyer from his new mentor's firm found Eleanor. There was no negotiation. There was an offer. $10,000, a fortune to her then, and a non-disclosure agreement. She was to vanish from his life and never reveal the paternity of her child. I threw the papers in the lawyer's face, Eleanor said, a flash of her old fire in her eyes. I told him my daughter wasn't for sale, but Julian, he never came back. He never fought for us. He let them cut us out of his life like a tumor. A few years later, my Sarah, your mother, she got sick. The doctors said it was her heart, that she was born with a weakness. I always believed it was a broken heart. She died when you were 5, Clara May, and all I had left was you and this key, a promise he never kept. Clara sank to the floor, wrapping her arms around her grandmother's knees. The story washed over her, a tidal wave of grief and fury. The monster from the restaurant wasn't just a rude billionaire. He was her grandfather. He was the man whose abandonment had set in motion the entire course of her life. The man whose ghost had haunted her family, culminating in her mother's early death. The cruelty at the restaurant suddenly made a terrible, twisted kind of sense. It wasn't random. He saw something of her mother, of Eleanor, in her face. And like a man haunted, he had tried to destroy the reflection. His torment was a desperate, pathetic attempt to prove to himself that he had made the right choice. That the women he'd left behind were insignificant, incompetent, worthy of his scorn. She looked at her grandmother, her fierce, proud Eleanor, whose mind was now a fragile, flickering light. She thought of her mother, a woman she barely remembered, whose life was cut short. The fight was no longer about a bad tip or a cruel comment. It was about them. It was about reclaiming a history that had been bought, buried, and denied. Julian Croft had built his empire on foundations of steel and concrete. Clara May Thompson was about to show him that the foundations of family, of memory, were stronger. He thought he had demolished his past. He was about to find out it was waiting for him, key in hand. The next morning, Clara moved with the cold, clear purpose of a woman who had nothing left to lose. She called Arya and quit her job, the manager's protest sounding distant and irrelevant. The waitress uniform was a skin she was shedding. Today she was a historian, and she was going to excavate the truth. Her target was Croft Tower, a shard of mirrored glass that pierced the Boston sky, a monument to the man who built it. She dressed not in black slacks and a blouse, but in the clothes she wore to defend her thesis proposal. A simple, professional wool dress, sensible shoes, and her hair pulled back. She was not coming as a supplicant or a victim. She was coming as an equal. The lobby was a cathedral of wealth, all gleaming Italian marble and hushed reverence. A receptionist sat behind a desk that looked like a modernist sculpture. "I'm here to see Julian Croft," Clara said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. The receptionist gave her a dismissive up-and-down glance. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but tell him Clara May Thompson is here. Tell him it's about the Blue Dahlia." She chose the name carefully. It was a piece of the past he would have thought was buried forever. The receptionist's perfectly plucked eyebrow rose a fraction. She murmured into her headset, her eyes widening slightly as she listened to the reply. Mr. Croft is in a board meeting. He will not be disturbed. His meeting just ended, Clara said, her gaze locking with the woman's. Tell him I know he's listening. Tell him Genevieve Wallace's granddaughter is here to talk about a promise. It was a bluff, a wild shot in the dark, weaving together the tile artist from the restaurant with the secret of the key. But it was a historian's gambit, connecting disparate pieces of the past to create a compelling narrative. Behind the receptionist, a discreet door opened, and a severe-looking man in a flawlessly tailored suit emerged. He had the weary, intelligent eyes of a man paid to solve impossible problems. Miss Thompson, he said, his voice a smooth baritone. I'm Arthur Vance, Mr. Croft's chief counsel. Perhaps you can discuss your business with me. My business is with him, Clara said, not breaking eye contact with the receptionist, who was now visibly flustered. You can tell your boss that he can hide behind his lawyers, just like he did 22 years ago, or he can face me himself. Arthur Vance's professional composure cracked for a second. The reference to a 2-decade-old event was a direct hit. He spoke quietly into his sleeve. He listened, his expression unreadable, then sighed. Against my strenuous and explicit advice, Vance said, turning back to Clara. He will see you. This way. The elevator ascended in unnerving silence, a pressurized capsule shooting them toward the sky. The doors opened directly into a sprawling penthouse office. The view of Boston was breathtaking, a king's vantage point. Julian Croft stood with his back to them, staring out at the city he owned. The abstract paintings on the walls and the minimalist furniture screamed power and control. Leave us, Arthur, Croft said, his voice gravelly. He didn't turn around. The doors hissed shut, sealing Clara in with him. You have 5 minutes, he said, his voice cold, controlled. I assume this is about money. It always is. Name your price. I'll have Arthur draw up the papers. Then you will disappear, just as your grandmother should have done. The sheer, breathtaking arrogance of it burned away the last of Clara's fear and replaced it with a glacial rage. Money? She let out a short, bitter laugh. You think that's what this is? After everything? You are so small, Julian. You live in this giant tower, but your soul wouldn't fill a thimble. She walked towards him, her footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. She stopped beside him at the window. Look out there, she said, her voice trembling with suppressed fury. You see a portfolio of assets? I see a city of stories. You tore down the old Orpheum Theater to build that monstrosity. She pointed. Did you know it was the first integrated theater in Boston? You demolished the Fenway Victory Gardens for a parking garage. Did you know they were planted by families waiting for sons who would never come home from the war? He finally turned to face her. The arrogant mask was in place, but his eyes were haunted. What is your point? My point, she said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper, is that you don't just destroy buildings. You destroy lives. You destroy histories, and you started with your own. She reached up and unclasped the chain from around her neck. She held out the tarnished brass key in the palm of her hand. This was the key to an apartment above the Blue Dahlia, she said, watching his face. A promise of a future you ran from, a future that resulted in a daughter named Sarah. My mother. He flinched, the name striking him like a physical blow. She died when she was 27, Julian, a congenital heart defect. The doctors called it a medical anomaly. My grandmother calls it a broken heart. She spent her entire life loving a ghost. And my grandmother Eleanor, she's in a nursing home now. Her memory's failing. Some days she doesn't even know who I am. But you know what she never ever forgets? Clara took a step closer, her eyes boring into his. She never forgets you. She never forgets the boy named Jay, who promised her a life he was too cowardly to build. That's a lie, he snarled, a cornered animal. She took the money. She signed the papers and disappeared. It was a transaction. She threw your blood money in your lawyer's face. Clara's voice rose, cracking with the force of her emotion. She chose her child, her dignity, over your payoff. You didn't know that, did you? It was easier to believe she was greedy. It was easier to build this empire if you believed you were the one who was wronged. She threw the key onto his massive empty desk. It landed with a small, defiant clatter that seemed to echo with the weight of decades. "I don't want your money," she said, her voice breaking. "I can't bring back my mother. I can't fix my grandmother's mind. The only thing I wanted was for you to know the truth, to know the names of the people whose lives are the foundation of this empty, gilded cage you've built for yourself. Sarah, Eleanor, they were real, and their story's over. Your 5 minutes are up." She turned and walked towards the elevator, her body shaking, every ounce of her strength spent. She had said what she came to say. She had honored them. "Wait." The word was quiet, cracked, stripped of all its usual authority. She stopped, her hand hovering over the call button, but she didn't turn around. "My father," Julian said, his voice sounding strange and distant. "He handled it. He told me she took the money. He showed me the signed papers, the cash check." He paused. "He told me she never even wanted to tell me about the child. He said she tried to leverage it for more." Clara slowly turned. Julian Croft was no longer looking at the city. He was staring at the key on his desk as if it were a venomous snake. The mask of the Titan was gone. In his place was a man staring into an abyss, the abyss of a 22. The silence that followed was not empty. It was a dense, suffocating vacuum, the kind that follows a detonation, where the air itself seems to have been burned away. Julian Croft, a man whose entire life was a monument to the power of controlled force, stood utterly inert, felled by a single weightless word: "90." The word echoed in the vast, sterile space of his office, stripping the Italian leather off the chairs, peeling the priceless abstract art from the walls, shattering the floor-to-ceiling windows that framed his kingdom. He saw the city spread below him, a sprawling circuit board of assets and liabilities he knew intimately. Yet it was suddenly alien, a map written in a language he no longer understood. He had built his life on a single granite-hard premise. He had been abandoned, betrayed by a woman who chose security over love, a woman who had tried to anchor his ascent with the dead weight of a child. This premise was the foundational bedrock upon which he had constructed his entire emotional edifice. The coldness, the ruthlessness, the conviction that sentiment was a fatal flaw and attachment a fool's game. Every landmark he demolished, every relationship he transactionalized, every ounce of empathy he cauterized from his own soul was a reinforcement of that initial defining wound. He had become Julian Croft, the Titan, because Jay, the boy who loved a nurse named Eleanor, had been murdered by her greed, and his own father had been the one holding the knife. "He showed me the documents," Julian whispered, the words ragged, torn from his throat. It wasn't a statement, it was a plea. He was a man drowning, grasping for the wreckage of a ship he hadn't known was sinking. A signed non-disclosure, a copy of a cash check, her signature. Clara watched him, her own righteous fury, the fuel that had propelled her to this precipice, now sputtering, replaced by a dizzying, hollow vertigo. The target of her decades-long, inherited hatred was disintegrating before her eyes. The monster was a puppet, and he was just now seeing the strings. The sight was not satisfying. It was terrifying. It was profoundly, achingly sad. "A signature can be forged," she said, her voice quiet, devoid of the fire it had held moments before. "A story can be fabricated. You build empires, Julian. You know better than anyone that the most convincing structures are often built on the most ruthlessly concealed lies." He stumbled backward, away from the window, away from the city that now felt like a testament to his delusion. He collapsed into his Eames chair, a piece of furniture that cost more than her car, and the supple leather sighed under his weight. He looked small in it. For the first time since she had met him, Julian Croft looked utterly and completely small. He wasn't looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the tarnished brass key she had thrown onto his desk. It sat there on the vast expanse of polished mahogany like an unexploded bomb. It was a primary source, an artifact that refuted the entire, carefully curated archive of his life. The discreet hiss of the office door sliding open broke the spell. Arthur Vance stepped inside, his face a carefully composed mask of concern. He had likely been listening to the entire exchange, the loyal consigliere monitoring a catastrophic failure in diplomacy. His eyes flicked from Julian's shattered posture to the key on the desk, then to Clara, standing by the elevator like a reluctant specter. "Julian?" Arthur's voice was gentle, the tone one used for a man on a ledge. Julian didn't look at him. His voice was a raw croak. "Arthur, you were there, a junior associate, in my father's office. The Eleanor Vance settlement." He wasn't asking a question. He was issuing a summons. Arthur's composure, for the first time Clara had seen, frayed at the edges. A flicker of an old, deep conflict, loyalty to the father versus loyalty to the son, played across his features. He straightened his tie, a gesture of a man bracing for impact. "I was present for some of the discussions, yes. The documents he showed me," Julian pressed, his voice gaining a terrifying edge of desperation. "The story he told me, that she took the money, that she wanted more, that she never wanted me to know about the child. Was it the truth?" Arthur Vance, a man whose career was built on the strategic deployment of words, chose his next ones with the precision of a surgeon laying down a scalpel. "Julian, your father was a formidable man. He had a very specific vision for your future, for the future of Croft Industries. He saw Eleanor, he saw the situation, as a profound threat to that vision. He took measures he felt were necessary to neutralize that threat. The narrative you were given was the one he believed would ensure you stayed on the correct trajectory. It was a lawyer's confession, wrapped in the silk of corporate euphemism, but it was a confession all the same. Neutralize the threat, the correct trajectory. He had not been protected, he had been managed. His heart had been the collateral damage in a hostile takeover of his own life. A sound tore from Julian's chest, a low, guttural noise of absolute agony. It was the sound of a keystone being removed from an arch, the sound of everything falling at once. He buried his face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking with dry, ragged sobs that seemed to be clawed up from a place that had been locked away for a lifetime. He had not just lost a past with Eleanor and a daughter he never knew. He had lost his entire present because it was built on a fiction. He was 62 years old, and he had just discovered that he didn't know the first thing about his own story. Clara felt a sudden, urgent need to flee. This was too raw, too private. She had come for a reckoning, not to witness a complete psychological demolition. She turned and pressed the elevator button, the small, illuminated circle a promise of escape. "Where is she?" His voice, muffled by his hands, stopped her cold. It was the question that hung in the air, the only question that now mattered. "Eleanor," he said, looking up. His face was a ruin. The Arctic blue eyes that had once assessed her with such contempt were now flooded with a terrifying, desperate plea. "Please, take me to her." The ride in the back of the Maybach was a study in surreal dislocation. The car, a hermetically sealed capsule of silent, air-conditioned luxury, glided through the streets of Boston and across the Charles River into Somerville. For Julian, it was a journey backward in time, a phantom limb aching with memories he had long ago amputated. He stared out the tinted window, not at the skyline he had personally authored, but at the triple-decker houses, the corner stores with faded awnings, the playgrounds filled with the shrieks of children. Each street corner was a ghost. There was the bakery where he'd bought Eleanor a cannoli on their third date. There was the small park where he'd first told her he loved her, the words feeling bigger and more real than any building he could ever imagine. This was the world he had fled, the world his father had taught him to despise as small, sentimental, and insignificant. He now realized it was the only world that had ever been real. Clara sat in the opposite seat, a chasm of quilted leather between them. She watched the man who was her grandfather navigate the ruins of his own memory. The anger she had harbored for a lifetime was a complex, wounded thing now. It was impossible to hate the broken man beside her with the same purity she had hated the Titan. His pain was real, palpable, but it did not erase the pain of her grandmother or the absence of her mother. His deception had been passive, a lie he had believed, but his cruelty had been active. The sneering remarks at Arya, the deliberate torment, that had been all him. A man lashing out at a ghost he didn't even know he was seeing in her face. Forgiveness was a continent away. She was still lost at sea. The Golden Years care home smelled of boiled cabbage, bleach, and a faint floral air freshener that couldn't quite mask the underlying scent of decay. It was the smell of waiting. Julian, in his $4,000 suit, was an immediate and jarring anomaly. Residents paused their slow shuffle down the hallway to stare. Nurses glanced up from their stations, their expressions a mixture of curiosity and professional caution. They found Eleanor in the common room, parked in a wheelchair before a television blaring a game show. Her gaze was fixed on the screen, but she wasn't seeing it. The fog was heavy today, a dense blanket that muffled the world. Her hands, gnarled with arthritis, lay still in her lap. A half-eaten cup of pudding sat on the tray before her. Clara felt a familiar pang of grief. This was the reality of her life, the quiet heartbreak she navigated daily. Bringing Julian here felt like a violation, like exposing a sacred wound to the man who had inflicted it. "Grandma," Clara whispered, kneeling beside the wheelchair. She gently touched Eleanor's hand. The skin was like worn parchment. "Grandma, someone is here to see you." Eleanor's head turned with a slow, disconnected movement. Her eyes, clouded and distant, drifted past Clara and settled on the tall man standing awkwardly in the doorway. Julian looked like he was going to be sick. This frail woman, this ghost in a floral housecoat, was the vibrant, laughing nurse he had held in his memory as a villain for 40 years. The dissonance was a physical blow. He forced his feet to move, each step on the linoleum floor an echoing pronouncement of his failure. He knelt on the floor on the other side of the wheelchair, a mirror image of Clara. The fabric of his expensive trousers strained. He was at her level now, the king brought low in the court of consequence. "Eleanor," he said, his voice a cracked whisper. He had rehearsed 1,000 things to say in the car. Apologies, explanations, pleas. But they all crumbled to dust in the face of this vacant reality. "It's me. It's Jay." Her gaze drifted over his face. There was no recognition, only a placid confusion. She looked at his gray hair, the deep lines etched around his eyes. He was a stranger, but the name Jay seemed to catch on something deep inside, a hook snagging a sunken line. A flicker of something crossed her face, a brief clearing in the fog. It wasn't quite recognition. It was something more primal, an echo. "Jay," she murmured, her voice a dry rustle. Her eyes moved from his face to the window behind him, looking at the gray afternoon sky. "You forgot the flowers. You always bring the flowers." A small, tremulous smile touched her lips, a smile for a boy who had ceased to exist decades ago. It broke him. The last retaining wall of his composure shattered into a million pieces. Tears streamed down Julian Croft's face, hot and unchecked. He wasn't crying for the man he was, but for the boy he had failed to be. In her fractured mind, time had collapsed. She had been waiting for him, and he was 40 years late. He reached out, his hand trembling, and gently took hers. It felt as small and fragile as a bird. "I know, Ellie," he choked out, the tears making his voice thick. "I'm so sorry, I forgot the flowers." Clara watched them, a silent observer to this devastating fragmented reunion. There was no catharsis here, no cinematic absolution. There was only this, a broken man clutching the hand of a broken woman, trapped in a sunless room at the end of a life built on a lie, with the granddaughter who was the living embodiment of their shared tragedy bearing witness. This, she realized, was not an ending. This was the wreckage. And now the salvage had to begin. The weeks that followed were a slow, arduous process of excavation. Julian did what he had always done when faced with an intractable problem. He threw money and logistics at it. Within 72 hours, Eleanor was moved from Golden Years to a state-of-the-art private memory care facility nestled in the Berkshires, a place that looked more like a luxury resort than a hospital. He hired a team of the world's leading neurologists, flying them in for consultations. He commissioned studies, funded research, demanded reports. He was trying to solve dementia the way he would solve a structural engineering flaw in a skyscraper, with overwhelming force and capital. But he also did something he had never done before. He showed up. Every single day, his helicopter would land in a nearby field, and he would spend hours in Eleanor's sun-drenched private suite. He didn't just sit. He engaged in a relentless, heartbreaking penance. He read her the poetry she had once read to him. He hired a music therapist to play the jazz standards from the Blue Dahlia. He brought in an archival botanist to fill her room with the exact varietals of flowers that grew in the public garden in the spring of 1998. Most days, she did not know him. On some days, she called him Arthur. On one particularly painful afternoon, she looked at him with eyes full of fear and called him father. But he kept coming back. He was learning the language of presence, a dialect he had never mastered. His attempts to connect with Clara were equally clumsy, mired in the transactional grammar he couldn't unlearn. He tried to wire a seven-figure sum into her bank account. The transfer was rejected. He had the deed to a penthouse apartment in his newest building delivered to her Somerville walk-up by courier. She sent it back. "I don't understand," he said one afternoon, cornering her in the hushed, elegant hallway of the new facility. "I am trying to make amends. This is what I have to offer. Why won't you take it?" "Because it's not amends, Julian. It's a transaction," Clara said, her voice weary. She had spent the morning helping her grandmother with a puzzle, only for Eleanor to sweep the pieces to the floor in a fit of frustration. She was exhausted. "You are trying to balance a moral ledger that can't be balanced. My mother is gone. My grandmother's mind is gone. You can't write a check for that." "Then what?" he demanded, his voice raw with the frustration of a powerful man rendered impotent. "What is it that you want from me?" "I wanted the truth. I have it," she said, looking him squarely in the eye. "Now I want to finish my degree. I want to get a job. I want to build my own life, not have it handed to me as a settlement for damages." She left him standing in the hallway, a king with a treasury full of currency that had no value here. Clara threw herself into her thesis, into the quiet, orderly world of archives and footnotes. It was her sanctuary, the one place where the past was neatly cataloged and made sense. But the lines had blurred. The story of Boston's architectural history was no longer separate from her own. She would be reading about land deals in the 19th century and see the ghost of Julian's father, manipulating lives for the sake of a legacy. She would study the floor plans of old tenement buildings and imagine Eleanor and Jay dreaming of their tiny studio above a jazz club. History was no longer abstract. It was flesh and blood. It was hers. 2 months after their confrontation in his office, a thick portfolio was delivered to her apartment. It wasn't from a lawyer. It was from the Croft Industries Architectural Division. Inside were the complete plans for his latest project, a 50-story mixed-use skyscraper set to be built at 45 Winter Street. The portfolio included demolition permits, structural surveys, and zoning variances. The building currently occupying the lot, a beautiful but neglected 19th century mercantile building, was slated to be torn down in 2 weeks. There was a simple handwritten note from Julian on top. "For your information." Rage, cold and clear, washed through her. It wasn't a gesture of goodwill. It was a test, or worse, a statement of fact. "This is who I am. This is what I do. I destroy the past to build the future." She didn't call. She went to his office, the portfolio clutched in her hand like a weapon. She bypassed the receptionist and walked straight in. He was on a conference call, his back to the door. He saw her reflection in the window and ended the call without preamble. "I see you received the plans," he said, turning to face her. "I did," she said, slamming the portfolio down on his desk. The sound was a gunshot in the quiet room. "And I have a question. Did you know that the facade of 45 Winter Street is one of the earliest surviving examples of cast-iron architecture in the city, designed by the same firm that built the Ether Dome at MGH? Did you know that the offices on the 3rd floor house the headquarters for the Massachusetts Woman's Suffrage Association from 1895 to 1910, and that some of the first drafts of the 19th Amendment were debated within those walls? Did your due diligence report mention that?" He was silent, his gaze fixed on her, but this time it wasn't dismissive. It was attentive. "My team's report classified it as a non-contributing structure with significant decay. A teardown," he said, his voice neutral. "Your team sees decay, I see a primary source document written in brick and iron, she retorted, her voice shaking with passion. You talk about your father's legacy, a legacy built on lies. That building has a legacy too, a real one. And you're going to obliterate it for another glass box that will be architecturally irrelevant in 30 years. You haven't learned anything. He walked over to the desk and picked up the portfolio. He slowly flipped through the pages, his expression unreadable. He stopped at a photograph of the building's dilapidated but elegant cornice. What would you do with it? He asked quietly. Clara was taken aback. What? If it were yours, if you had unlimited capital, what would you do with 45 Winter Street? The historian in her took over. I would restore it, not modernize it, restore it. I'd peel back the layers of cheap 20th century renovations. I'd expose the original ironwork, restore the hardwood floors, the tin ceilings. The ground floor could be retail, but the upper floors should be a museum, a Boston Center for Social History, a place that tells the stories you can't see from a skyscraper. He stared at her for a long, silent moment, a silent assessment that was entirely different from the first one he'd ever given her. He was not valuing her as a waitress or an annoyance. He was valuing her expertise. He picked up his phone. Janet, cancel the demolition schedule for 45 Winter Street indefinitely and get the preservation team on the line. I want to set up a preliminary meeting. I have a new consultant I want them to meet. He looked at Clara, a flicker of something new in his eyes. Respect. Her name is Thompson. There was no magical reconciliation. Their relationship was not rebuilt. It was constructed from scratch, on a new and difficult foundation. It was forged in the quiet hours by Eleanor's bedside, where they would sometimes read aloud to her from the same book, their voices overlapping. It was hammered out in tense architectural meetings, where Clara, as lead historical consultant, would argue fiercely with Julian's engineers about preserving an original window frame, and he, to the astonishment of his entire company, would side with her. 1 year later, on a crisp autumn afternoon, Clara stood with Julian on the 4th floor of 45 Winter Street. The building was a chaotic skeleton of its future self, filled with scaffolding, the air thick with the smell of sawdust and plaster. Below them, a team of artisans was painstakingly restoring the original tin ceiling panels. Julian was no longer the imposing titan of Aria. The past year had weathered him, softened the granite edges. He still wore expensive suits, but they seemed less like armor. He looked at the intricate ceiling work, then at Clara. Your mother, he said, his voice quiet. She would have been 41 this year. It was the first time he had ever spoken of her directly, not as a concept, but as a person with an age, a life. Clara's throat tightened. Yes, she whispered. I have been thinking, he continued, looking out the large arched window at the city below, about legacies. My father built one of power and steel. I continued it, but it's hollow. Its foundation is rotten. He turned to her, his blue eyes clear. Preserving this building, it's a better foundation, a truer one. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tarnished brass key. He had carried it with him every day for the past year. He held it out to her. The blue dahlia is long gone, he said. This key doesn't open a door to an apartment anymore, but it opened the door to the truth. It belongs to the historian. Clara looked at the key in his palm, then at his face. She saw the decades of regret, the pain of his own stolen past. But she also saw the man he was becoming, one who understood that value was not just created, but preserved. She closed her hand over his, her fingers covering the key. It was a beginning, a quiet, difficult, and profoundly real beginning, built not on forgiveness, but on the shared, painstaking work of restoration. Together, in the heart of a building they were saving, they had started to salvage the ruins of a family, creating something new, something true, something that might just be strong enough to last.